everybody, and welcome to the 41st episode of Retuning Your Firm. For those who haven't been on the show before, what's it all about? Well, in very simple terms, it's when the car's in the pit stop, don't just cover it with a tarpaulin. Go and investigate and find out exactly what it is that you are needing to do with that car and fix it. So when you go back on the track, guess what? Everything's in a good place. So what are we going to be talking about today? Well, today's themes, non-exec directors. How many firms have them? Well, some professional firms do, and many don't. Somebody say that maybe it's a wave and we're over the peak. Who knows? But anyway, Nicola Sawford's going to come and enlighten us on exactly what it's all about as a serial non-exec director. We're also looking at online events. I think many people recognise that yes, there will be real face-to-face events post-COVID, but actually there's going to be quite a lot of online events as well. And the important experience that you give, whether it's to your partners at a partner conference or to your clients at a client conference, is really interesting. And Iain Beveridge is going to say, well, are we all going to wander around with virtual headsets? Probably not. But is it all going to be on Zoom? Probably not as well. So that's an interesting area to explore. And then the last one is data standards. Now, that may sound a little bit dull, but actually it's really fundamental, because if you think about it, if all data was structured in a common way, then all advisors could access it without having to completely reinvent their access points and everything associated with it. So we've got Shamus from Engine B, who's going to be talking a little bit about that. So those are our exciting themes for today. Who's on again? I'll just run through them again quickly, so at least you can see the names. So Nicola Sawford, non-exec director, was previously, as you may have saw from my note, involved at Sawford as the chief executive. Shamus Ray, who is the chief executive of a gorgeously named organization, Engine B. And one day I shall ask him, how did you come up with that name? It's really interesting and strange and original, which is fun. Iain Beveridge of Telepresent, who again has really created a whole new career for himself in the past year with all the changes that we've been seeing. Francesca, our anchor tenant, always lovely to have you, brings a ray of sunshine to every single one of these polls, telling me she's going to miss one next month, which is a bit sad, but hey, all good. And obviously yours truly, Richard Chaplin, founder and chief executive of the Managing Partners Forum. So that's today's panel in order of appearance. And let's now move on. Let's just remind ourselves, what are we actually here for? What is it all about? And what are 7 strategies for retuning your firm? Well, the first one is you've got to think big. It could be DARPA, if you read the news today, or its area, I think they're calling it, which is the new innovation thing that government's throwing £800 million at. So I think that should be an interesting opportunity. But you've got to believe 6 impossible things before breakfast. I hope you've all had your breakfast. Think small. Focus on some of the angles that will resonate with your key audiences. That could be your clients, could be your people. Because if you don't, your communications will just go astray. Remember that, yes, you are the power of your relationships, but the key word that you really need to focus on is reciprocity. It's not much use having an address book, telephone directory in the old days. That really doesn't help you. It's actually, are you looking actively to create a win-win with the key people that you're dealing with? If not, it won't be as effective as it could be. Think about campaigns. We're 41 episodes here. I've got a whole group of people who come in every week, which is wonderful. This is something that really does create and convert an audience into a community. You've got to drop convention. You've got to try new ideas. You've got to try new services. That's, I think, inevitable. But at the same time, remember that you've got to get there quickly. Speed is of the essence. And think about what you're actually doing. There's a lovely philosophy called Lean Start. It basically says that actually when you start anything in life, first thing you have to do is to articulate your assumptions. As an accountant, I can tell you if I change the accounting policies, I change the profit. So the same sort of idea in a way. In other words, what are the assumptions underlying whatever you have in mind to do? And you've got to articulate them, spell them out. And then when you sort of go out and you actually sort of launch your product, what you're doing in practice is you are market testing your assumptions. And if, and in reality, it's probably when they prove invalid, and they will, then you've got to pivot and do them go in a slightly different direction. And the beauty of that approach is it depersonalizes it. It's not like partner X wants that way and partner Y wants Z. If they can agree on the assumptions, then if the assumptions don't stack up, then clearly it's fairly easy what they need to do about it. And you've got to be entrepreneurial. You've got to be listening and innovating. And everybody thinks entrepreneurs are innovating. Actually, listening is even more important. If you're not listening to your clients, if you're not listening to your marketplace, your services will be, let's say, suboptimal. I think that's probably the best way to describe it. So I'd like to thank Elena Kutsko of Globseka Bratislava for that particular insight. So what's going on in the forum? There's a couple of things going on here. We've got some upcoming events, sustainability and ESG. What does that mean for your clients, and how can you enable sustainable business transition? And that's next week. And on the 17th of March, a big event, Fast Track Innovation, government funded, 2 years in the making, really interesting, looking at how design sprints can help you tackle pretty much any business challenge. So that's certainly worth looking into if you haven't already signed up. Just about a month away now, just under. What else? Awards. Gosh, I keep on. 7 days left. That's getting quite tight now. So if you haven't recognized that this is probably the year par excellence that management's contribution to the business has been at times existential, then you've missed a lot of points, because the firms which were well managed are clearly going to be the ones, I think, that come out of the pandemic or the post-COVID period looking in the best shape. And if all they've done is shelter under the tarpaulin, then I'm afraid that's not a good place to be. So if you haven't thought about it, you've still got time to get that submission in. It's all on the website in the usual way. Last week, we had Kim Tasso, James Falconbridge, and Luke Bardin. Their 5-minute slots are all available on the forum website in the usual place. So over 100 of them now. So it's a really good. And we're getting, I think, about 900 views on a monthly basis across those actual Hear From Experts videos. So that's pretty popular, I think, on the whole, I would say. So let's move on. Polls. What are we talking about here? Well, we do a poll every week, as those who are familiar with the program will be aware. And the feedback from government is always very much, well, you can read your poll results are incredibly valuable in our analysis during these dynamic times. I didn't ask them for it. It was unprompted feedback, and very welcome too, of course, because it's nice. And I think 1 week I was late in sending them the findings. They asked me where they were, which is my definition of thought leadership. So where else? Well, it isn't just government, because one of the polls we did back in, I think it was in June, was picked up by the House of Lords in their report on the future of UK-EU relationships. I think if you read that report, you'll be rather sad at some of the opportunities that were missed, but I'm not trying to make any political points here. The more important point to me was that actually our poll was seen as being valid evidence, and the only other data used was government sourced. So that was in itself indicates a bit about the power of these polls that I'm about to ask you to complete. The obvious underlying message is the more of you do it, the better, because that has more impact, but that's kind of given, I guess. There's also a poll out at the moment, which is a more traditional one, linked to the conference on the 17th of March, Fast Track Innovation. Some of you hopefully will have picked that up yesterday because we went out with it. And we're really looking there at things like what are the drivers, the barriers to change, and what's actually happening in the sector. So hopefully that will inform the conference. And if you, again, haven't had the chance to do that, that's open till next Tuesday of, in other words, the 2nd of March. So please think about doing that. As for the CEO and C-suite across the board in professional services. So what happened last week? Well, I'm just going to take you through the property poll, and in a slightly different way, because some of the stuff you will have seen already. But if you go back to the one we do every month, which is our monthly tracker, as you can see, we kind of moved the blue being expansion, kind of did a zigzag in the middle all over the place. And last time we did it, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago, we did it again next week. The blue and the red weren't that far apart compared with Boris bound territory of a year ago. But what is interesting is that actually, if you ask about the proportion of people working from home, hasn't really shifted much. And if you talk about the changes to office space requirements, again, hasn't really shifted much over that period. So there's clearly one area is zigzaggy in terms of activity. The others seem to be much more flat, which indicates, I think, much more likely to be a permanent change. So what did we ask last week? Well, first of all, we asked you what type of offices, and pretty much everybody was saying that traditional leased offices are going to remain the core space that people occupy, and that's fair enough. We also asked a little bit about pounds per square foot. There's lots of data there. If I say that the average is about £100 a square foot, that includes service charges and rates. That's about what that was telling us. And in terms of the average typical desk vacancy, about 25% came through from that chart. We also looked at the whole area of commuting and the extent to which people pre-COVID, and if you think you can remember what that was like, you are deluding yourself, but pre-COVID, what was the sort of percentage of people who were permanent in the full-time in the office? And it was about 80+%. And then, as you can see from the 2 blue bars, it's there's a preference to 3 days a week, but there's still a big chunk on 2 days a week. So that's a fairly fundamental shift. Now, what does that mean? And here's a very simple analogy. You've got 100 employees, £100 a square foot, £100 cost, 25% vacancy. Do the math. You are talking about a 46% excess space charge against your P&L if you are coming in with 2.7, which is approximately where the days per week work through. And most finance directors are looking at that and thinking, I could save some money here, obviously. What else do we said? Well, the other question we asked was how many minutes are people actually commuting to the office? And again, there's a lot of data there, but it's about just under about an hour. I think 56 minutes was what came through as the average on that one. And if we then do this one, this is all looking at one which is probably going to be quite high on your, well, let's say your recruitment messaging, if nothing else. What's called CO2 equivalent in the jargon, apparently. But basically, if you've got, again, your 100 and everybody came in on public transport, then you are looking at £2 of CO2 equivalent a day. Whereas if everyone's in a private car, it's 40. And then if you do the math, you can actually see that your annual saving in tons at the bottom is somewhere between 8 tons and 165 tons. And that's just for 100 people. Now, if you have 1,000 people, you can do the math beyond that. So I think there's some fairly interesting conversations in the board to be taking place around, are we doing enough to actually encourage what I might call more eco-friendly commuting, put it that way. Office-related benefits, you probably can't read these, but things like dress code, wellness and mentoring, the two which really moved a bit. In other words, they're things that people are thinking are going to be a lot more active looking into the future. And what about sustaining corporate culture? We had a really interesting meeting of the finance group around this last week, and a lot of active people. And I think the jury is really out on this. Some people are converting their offices. Some people are just sort of actually just doing lunch and learn. Some people are actually putting an online presence in as well, which Iain may pick up on later. So there's quite a lot of stuff that's going on. And I think a lot of people are very much scratching their head as to how do we sustain our culture in this world of what I think are going to become hybrid workplaces. So that's about enough of me for the poll for last week, but I think it was an interesting one. And believe me, it is absolutely on the top of the agenda for just about every firm at the moment, is that whole issue. I think corporate culture is probably the best way to describe it, but we'll see. Anyway, so let's talk about this week's poll. So what have we got here? I think the first thing is that there is agreement that professionalism is an antidote to populists, with 50% of you saying you agree and slightly under 50% either not neutral or disagreeing. It's only 12%. So I think I'd read from that there is a fairly clear message there. I think when it then comes to definition of professionalism, people are fairly clear that it's not about having your external ratification, your qualification, if you like, that's the low. Technical competence, equally low. But 2/3 of you saying that ethical competence is actually what really defines professionalism. So let's just see the extent to that's the case. In terms of to what extent is bad behaviours impacting perceptions of professionalism, again, 70% of you would agree with that. So in other words, you can be ethically fantastic, but if there's a lot of I don't know, all sorts of things like lack of transparency, misconduct, poor empathy, elitism, all the things that the media love talking about, then that absolutely doesn't do us any favours, with only 20% disagree with that, but I think there's a strong consensus. So let's look at one of the attributes that people believe to be rated most highly. And the three that come out, and you can see this if you're going down, are competence and knowledgeability equally. And then there's a bit of a gap until you come down to being trustworthy. Now, as we said, the definition of ethics was around, the definition of professionalism was around ethics. Are they consistent? Good question. So let's talk about what happens if you're a doctor. Well, you've got a very different set of issues there. You are caring, you are competent, very, very strongly, and really and are knowledgeable. So you've got to know your medicine, if you like. So comparing, say, the business professionals to the health professionals, you get a very different outcome in terms of what's expected by that professional. Now, what about the things that people should be doing? And again, this is really where I think you're beginning to now see a change, because what you're saying is that, most professional advisors rate themselves according to their competence and their knowledgeability and that stuff. But actually, the things, knowledgeable is still there. That's important. But the ethics are coming through much stronger, and the competence. So it's a much more of a trust. So there's a much more sort of nuanced position that emerges. And in terms of the doctors, though, actually there aren't any significant differences. Caring competence and knowledgeability remain. So in other words, whilst I think the caring professions probably are fairly closely aligned between what the people who are practicing think is important and what you as an audience, as a group, think is important vis-a-vis professionalism. When it comes to business professionals, there's a bit of a disconnect there. So I think that's quite important to see. Should we be absolutely promoting our professionalism? 90-something% of you agree with that. So yeah, that's a very strong message. In terms of, is it important to be passionate and have personal morality? And let's face it, those are attributes of the populace, if you like. Absolutely, again, 90, just under about 90%, 85% of you agree with that. And in terms of where might the focus be? A focus on ethical competence comes through very strongly, as does, interestingly, technical competence. And the one that is probably next is community contribution and shaping public attitude. So nothing very radical there. Just let's promote the things that we think are important. But the challenge we have, as you'll have seen, is that actually, in your view, most of the people who are practicing business professionals are not rating those areas as highly when they're delivering services to clients as they might do if they had professionalism in mind. So there's some quite interesting issues emerging from that, which we may talk about in the debate. So I'll stop sharing now, and I will hand over to our first speaker. So I'd like to welcome Nicola. Come and tell us about non-exec directors.
Thanks, Richard. Firstly, just a little bit more about me for context. As Richard said, I'm a non-executive director. My career spanned many sectors, including professional and financial services, technology, retail, property, media, and regulation. I trained as an accountant and progressed through finance director roles before becoming a CEO. And as a NED for the last 8 years, I've added more strategic performance, risk, and governance skills. And today I wanted to share with you what a NED or advisor can add to your board and share some examples from my experience of being a NED in the times of COVID, which sounds remarkably like a Gabriel Garcia Marquez novel. NEDs on professional services boards are still a rare breed. So I thought I'd start with some of the basics of what NEDs bring to the table. NED responsibilities usually include culture, strategy, performance, risk, remuneration, and policies. But in addition, I wanted to highlight 4 characteristics which I've found to be important and valued. And the phrase most used to describe NEDs is a critical friend, and that really does sum it up. A good NED brings a level of challenge combined with a healthy dose of support. Secondly, they should bring diversity of thought or cognitive diversity. That'll come from ensuring that your NED has sufficiently broad and different experience and knowledge that, whilst complementary, brings a new perspective to your board. This can be really important in a professional services setting to help avoid groupthink. Thirdly, independence. This means they've no vested interests. They aren't part of the hierarchy. They aren't worried about their pep. And most importantly, they can speak truth to power. Finally, it's soft skills. These are some of the most important. A good NED needs a healthy dose of EQ, as they should spend quite a lot of their time listening, supporting, encouraging collaboration, and providing a friendly ear. So it's particularly important for the CEO or managing partner, a role that can otherwise be very lonely. So I thought it would be useful to bring this to life with some practical examples from my experience over the past year. Firstly, focusing on strategy and transformation. It's too easy for the management team to feel the pressure to bring in new technology. Everyone's doing it and they feel they're getting left behind. But as you know, you need to make sure the technology is an enabler of change, not the driver, a means to an end, and not the end in itself. On one of my boards, we've addressed this by first looking at and challenging the way the business works and developing a target operating model, making sure it supports the strategy and is fit for purpose. Then the executive looked at the transformation programme, and only towards the end did we look at what part digital could play in the delivery. Digital actually plays a major part, but importantly, we didn't assume that. During COVID, the temptation was to pause the programme, but instead the board re-reviewed, refocused, and agreed that actually, rather than being a distraction, it was an ideal time to press on. And we're actually seeing really great results. Secondly, I wanted to look at focusing on customers and clients. It's an area where organisations can really learn lessons from different sectors, whether that be how you gain and retain new clients, how you engage and get feedback, how you map the customer journey, or the data you keep and analyse. On one of my boards, in a different sector, we challenged the executive to find a way to get more immediate and regular feedback. The result was using an external digital solution called Rant and Rave. It's completely changed our understanding of our customers, but also how we engage with them. It's led to a reduction in complaints and is providing invaluable, actionable feedback. Whilst using a product like Rant or Rave or a net promoter score might feel alien in the professional services world, tracking customer satisfaction is still vital. And during COVID, that same board supported the executive to look creatively at how best to use the staff who weren't able to work. And rather than being furloughed, they were given new roles, which included making over 3,500 customer care calls. Finally, I wanted to turn, only briefly, you'll be pleased to hear, Richard, to culture and inclusion. These are important in any organisation, and professional services firms are no exception, particularly with the importance of talent acquisition and retention. Ned's played an important role with the board in setting the tone and promoting culture. During COVID, all organisations had to suddenly rethink how they communicated and engaged remotely with their staff. This was easier for those with an embedded culture that focused on trust, accountability, empowerment, and collaboration. Counterintuitively, if managed well, I found that during the COVID process, it actually helped strengthen the culture and inclusivity. Now, I know you've all been there and heard quite a lot about this already, but what I found interesting on all my boards was the Neds sharing what their other boards were doing, what worked, and helping each other to avoid reinventing the wheel. A lot of it was practical little things that really helped the whole team feel engaged and included, for example, whether that be regular YouTube updates from the leaders, Zoom 11s, creative projects, cooking challenges, no agenda meetings, team virtual daily walks, wellbeing buddies, or even Zoom charades. Yes, we did do Zoom charades. So to finish, hopefully most of you already have Neds on your boards and have similar tales to tell. But if not, maybe now is a good time to think about the benefits of getting one. Richard, back to you.
Oh, thanks very much. That's, as always, fascinating. I don't know how you managed to put so much into such a short period. I'm not sure. It's brilliant. So thank you very much. We look forward to that debate a little bit later and to pick up some of those points. I'd like to turn now to Shamus and hear a little bit about his area of expertise. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Richard. And good morning, everybody. Hopefully you've had some caffeine before I start talking about data. Richard actually asked about why Engine B is called Engine B, so let me just cover that off, actually. So I was, a few years ago, part of KPMG globally, looking at the digitization of all 300 services in KPMG, from audit, tax, and legal. We always used to refer to KPMG as this big super tanker going down, and very difficult to move and change quickly. So Engine A is the super tanker, and Engine B was supposed to be an agile, fast-moving developer of services, etc., to try and kind of break the mold. And so that's what Engine B was created. Needless to say that the first thing we did was focus on data. Then the SEC in the US declared that Engine B needed to be totally independent of KPMG, so it became a separate entity. So it's now what I like to think of as an agile speedboat next to the super tanker of all professions rather than just KPMG. So that's Engine B, and I'm CEO of Engine B, and we're very focused on the very dull stuff about data, and we're obsessed about common data models and knowledge graphs, all kinds of techie things. But let me just try and put it into context, because the work that we've done looking at law firms, and we work with 6 law firms and 9 accounting firms, well, actually 13 accounting firms now, and various associations and universities, so with Imperial College, with Birmingham Law School, etc., and even the University of Illinois. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to open up and solve a data problem. But let's put it into context. You all work with client data all the time. Our analysis says that accountants spend about 30 to 35% of their time sorting out client data, and lawyers spend 20 to 25% of their time. It'd be interesting to know if that's your experience. sorting out client data before it's usable for you to use, right? You're piling around in team rooms, you're asking your client for the latest contract on a lease, etc. So how can we solve that problem? And that's the problem which NGB was born to solve, and is doing so using all kinds of WYSI techniques. And as I say, we built something called a common data model, right? So if you want to share data between law firms, or between the law firm and a bank, or a law firm and a client, wouldn't it be great if everybody knew what standard the data was going to come in, and it was easy for you to manage, review, and manipulate? So we're trying to define that first, and we've made some huge progress on doing that with the firms, etc. And we've also started to play with some technology and put technology in which allows firms to find and connect data. Now, if you use Google, or if you have had a previous career in MI6, then you would have found something called knowledge graphs, which connect data up across lots of different sources, so you can start making assumptions and trying to find true data. And so we've started building knowledge graphs for legal, tax, and audit. And in fact, one of the very first ones we built is a property knowledge graph. If you take the common data model, which we've defined, and you put knowledge graphs on top, how does that help a law firm? Well, at the moment, you probably, if you want to start looking at leases of your client, and your client's going, look, can you go through all my leases? I'm about to reduce down the amount of property I need in the UK because of post-COVID working from home type mentality. Then you'll go to them and go, okay, well, give me all your leases. And they'll probably give you 200 or 300 leases for about 10 properties. So how do you know which one's the right lease? And how do you know where to find them? And in fact, it'll probably take your client several years and 2 or 3 careers to find all the right leases. So the first thing we're trying to do is solve that problem, right? Can we find all the leases or the contracts in the client environment, work out which one's the most recent one by cross-matching between the finance systems in terms of what's the actual rent paid and what's the rent in the lease, for example, and going, okay, that's the right lease for this document. Secondly, we want to be able to allow you to ask more complicated questions, right? So you might want to go, I want to look at all my client leases. Let's just say the client sends you all their leases. I want to look at all the client leases, and I want to look for leases which have termination clauses less than 6 months, because you probably want to focus on those first. So you can do that. But let's make it even more complicated, right? And go, actually, let me look for all leases where there is a supplier called Arconic, which is unfortunately the supplier to the Grenfell cladding. So I'll look for all properties which my client has, which has a lease of more than 3 years and has Arconic as a supplier. And you could make that request to a knowledge graph and to a common data model set, and you get all the leases back. So you get, so by having common data models and having knowledge graphs, which are widely used by people like Google and MI6, you can start making complex queries to find the right pieces, so that actually your staff can be focused on actually bringing what you define as professionalism, which is absolutely right, which is all about the kind of ethical view, the knowledge, etc. And it shouldn't be about trying to work your way through data. So why am I here today? Because actually we're doing an open source project on the data model. So it's going to be available to everybody and anybody to use. And we're working heavily with Microsoft and their engineering team on a global basis. As I said, we're working with a load of accounting firms around the world. And we're working with 6 law firms. But we need more people to be involved to help us finish off the knowledge graphs around property. The data model's already been done, but we're building the knowledge graphs for property with Birmingham Law School, with Imperial, with 6 law firms. We need more. And we're going to start working on supply chain. And then we're going to make that all available to all of you to use to make yourselves far more efficient than you are today. And that way you can focus on what is truly professionalism rather than data management. Thanks, Richard. Over to you.
Fantastic, as always. A different topic. We haven't really covered that one, I think, in our sessions before, and I think it's really interesting to see these important things going on, almost sort of in the background, but absolutely will if sort of if Shamus achieves his vision, then the way that we will be interacting with our clients over data will fundamentally shift. And I think that's really interesting, and also allows the possibility for different advisors to work with the same organization in a much easier way, because there are less barriers to conversion and stuff like that. So our third and our final guest today is Iain Beveridge. So Iain, as I mentioned, runs an organization called Telepresent, and is somebody who has built a really interesting business around helping professional firms and all sorts of other organizations engage with their clients in an online world. Over to you, sir.
Good morning, everybody. Do excuse me, I have a lovely cold, but I will try and sound as clear as I can. So Richard's asked us along today. We've been engaging with Richard on a couple of projects recently. We are a communication and event agency. We connect people, and our focus is very much on two-way and group communications, telepresence, and group enablement. So we run high-level meetings, trade missions, parliamentary groups, society events, academic and commercial conferences, and larger corporate events and corporate culture enhancement. But we're completely technology agnostic, so we're not going into any situation saying here is a platform or here is a solution and here are the benefits and this is why you should use it. We're listening to what an organization wants to achieve. People generally call us in where they want to elevate their communications, or they want to find a way to transition a particular event or activity or conference online. Obviously accelerated by what's been happening in the past year, but also a sign of a change in communications approach being driven by the concept of new normal. I won't go into that because I appreciate I'm limited on time today, but if we have time in the panel discussion later, no doubt we can have a look. So we've all got used to video calls, and we use Zoom a lot. Zoom has a lot of depth. It's got a lot of capability, particularly for meetings. People can pop up and ask questions in the Q&A at the end, and people feel more present and included than in a webinar. Webinars can be quite cold. We can't see you. It's quite an alien experience. I'm much more comfortable talking with people rather than at them. And being present is really important. It massively increases attention, retention, and you feel a lot more engaged. And there have been various psychological studies that says that when you're actively engaged with a process, you're releasing endorphins. You're feeling good. Whereas when you're passively watching something, it can be a little dampening on your psyche and your mood. Zoom lets us do proper hybrid events as well. So we do use Zoom quite a lot for that. We recently did one for the Princess Royal where we had 30 people in a room and 40 people online, and there needed to be communication between these two groups. So we deployed a film crew, put large screens in the room, and fully connected these two groups of people together so that at various points, different people, both in the room and online, were able to talk with their respective parties and ensure the event that usually would have been in person went off without a hitch. So that's fine when you've got sort of 30 people in a room and 30 or 40 people online. But how do you do that with 100 people or 1,000 or 4,000? What are the communication dynamics? Who is going to be able to talk with whom? We hear a lot of people talking about, we want to do hybrid events. And the first thing we do is stop and say, well, what's your understanding of what a hybrid event is? Because there's about 15 or 20 different variations on a theme when looking at hybrid. And something that I know Richard wanted me to touch on was the different levels of communication platforms that are out there and the different ways that people can engage. So I understand that you had Iain from Remo on the show recently, and Remo is a really good example of one of the next level platforms. So in Zoom, even for large meetings, we've done some with Imperial recently. Rather than using webinar, we've had several hundred online. There's an understood etiquette, but we can have that engagement in the end, and people, when they put Q&A in, can pop up and ask questions. But Remo is a platform where There are a number of tables, and each table is a private video chat, so you can bring several hundred people into the platform. They can be chatting before the main event with each other, with their people on the table, as you would if you went to a conference and had a coffee before things started. And then you can inject various presentations, various materials into the event, and you can encourage discussion, and you can encourage people to move around under their own steam. So Remo is a little bit of a step up in terms of orienting audience members, and in terms of the computer power, broadband power needed. Not a lot, a little step, but it provides massive increased enhancement in terms of enabling groups to be able to feel present and engage. And it also allows you to mix things up, to change formats and make an event far more engaging. So, for example, with some of the livery stuff we've been doing, you might arrive, you'll be welcomed, then you'll be back at tables, then there might be some speeches, then you'll be back at tables and moving around and talking with your colleagues, and then there might be some toasts and things at the end of the evening. So we can start to recreate some of that interpersonal engagement, some of that social bonhomie, and empower the guest, empower the user to have more control over their involvement in the event. And that makes people more fully engaged, because they know people will be discussing what's been said at tables. Retention levels go through the roof in the same way they do when people actively participate. So I'm sure everybody is familiar with the learning pyramid, when if you're in a lecture, you retain about 5% of what's going on. Audio visual gives you about 20% retention. As soon as you get into group discussion, retention levels go north of 50%. So the level of engagement and what people take away and how they feel changes dramatically as you start to use other mediums. So our rule is less talking at and more talking with massively enhances engagement and retention, and people have a more enjoyable time. These second level platforms are also hugely valuable for groups who know each other already. So in terms of corporate engagement, in terms of corporate culture, we do a lot of work with livery companies, clubs and societies who've embraced this next level, as they can mingle and socialize, catch up with friends, and break off for private conversations, which brings me on to inclusion. Online events can be more inclusive, not less, than the traditional in-person events. At a recent event, an elderly gentleman sought me out and just said, "I just want to say thank you. I can't get to town much anymore, and this has been the first company event that I've been able to attend for years, and it's been an absolute delight to catch up with old friends and see people again." And I was talking with a colleague who was telling me how attendance at their recent AGM by people with disabilities was markedly up, due to the fact that it was held online this year. So online events can be more inclusive rather than less. But what about the results? One of the parliamentary groups we work with, and we're actually using Zoom in meeting mode for that, have said they're not going back to the way things were before. So they're getting more parliamentarians attending, they're covering more ground, and they're achieving more than when everybody had to trog up to the committee rooms. So they're planning to have most future meetings online now, with just a few events each year in Parliament to keep that personal connection, possibly even more on a sort of quasi-social basis. So the first level is video conferencing. That's what we've all got used to: Zoom, WebEx, Teams. Not to be underestimated, has huge power under the bonnet if you know how to use it. Can be slightly dangerous if you don't. You don't want to be looking like a cat when you're in meetings. It needs to be used well. The next level is networking and engagement platforms like Remo and AirMeet. A little bit more computer power, a little bit more orientation sometimes, but massive enhanced benefits, particularly when you're dealing with groups of people that you want to be able to enable to communicate with each other, as well as to simply digest what you're saying. And by adding that level, you're increasing your own results in terms of retention as well. There are levels above that. So we go into something called XR, extended reality, and then we go up into VR, virtual reality. And there's a whole melting pot, which has been particularly accelerated in the last year, of mingling and mixing between these various levels. So you can be kind of level 2 or level 1 even. You can be adept at video conferencing, but you can go and join a meeting that's happening in VR, if the VR is the platform that particular organisation are using. So video conferencing, engagement platforms. XR, when you what does XR give you that the engagement platforms don't? Well, you start getting into proximity audio. You start being able to loiter near a group and listen to what's being said and decide whether you want to move in to that group or not. You're able to have in between event connections. So when you're moving from the conference hall to somewhere else, or if I'm in my virtual office, one of my team can pop the head round the door and say, "Hi, Iain, have you got a couple of minutes?" So it's not scheduled, it's much more spontaneous, and you can start to create those kind of spontaneous engagements that you have difficulty with when everything has to be scheduled. Excited?
Francesca, come and give us your thoughts for today.
Oh, fantastic, Iain. That was really, really engaging. And I love how you're using that technology, because, my gosh, how many of us have just sat in front of a screen for hours of our life and wondered there must be a better way. So thank you very much for that. And also, Shamus, as always, really, really great insight. I love the knowledge graphs in particular. I wonder if I can come back to the non-exec point, because I thought Nicola gave a fantastic oversight of how valuable they are. And I know from personal experience that our organisation has really benefited from having independent non-execs. We were talking earlier on before the show started about sometimes you can't be a prophet in your own land. You do often need to have someone who's external to say the things that are kind of not able to be said, sometimes by people within the organisation, or you just get so groupthink orientated you don't often see it. So our global board is run by a non-exec. We have 2 non-execs on that. In our UK firm, they have 3 non-execs, and our partnership oversight board is run by one of those non-execs. And it's made such a difference. I mean, one about calling people to account, another about bringing a different insight, sometimes from a different experience. On our global board, we have an IT specialist, very, very skilled. I actually have 2 IT specialists, actually, one of slightly different areas of technology. But just that sense of bringing in the rest of the world into the professional services environment, and it's hugely valuable. Our chair of our global board has who's a super smart lady, I have to say, but also has a really good saying. She says, "I can ask the stupid questions that you're too embarrassed to ask." And I love that. I love the fact that you almost have a freedom as a non-exec to ask those questions. If you've been working in an organisation for 15, 20 years, you sometimes stop asking them because you go, "Oh, I'm a bit frightened to do that." And I think it's a really good calling to account. And also, if you're in an organisation where that feels like an expense that's not possible, or it's too difficult to do that, even bringing in somebody who's more of a mentor coach to the board, I think is hugely valuable. And having a good friend. I've seen some organisations where they've actually shared the ability for the leader of one firm to help the other firm has gone to their firm, and they've done some collaborative sharing around coaching and sharing experience, which I also think is hugely valuable. It's about diversity of thinking.
Nicola, just sort of bringing you into here, I mean, one of the things that I think not a lot of non-execs struggle with is knowing enough to ask sensible questions. I mean, how do you go about finding out what the real issues are? Because being a friend is one thing, but your best friend knows your secrets, if you know the logic.
Absolutely. Well, yes, I mean, we talk about sort of being independent and obviously being someone who's not involved in the business on a day-to-day basis. But that doesn't mean you don't really have to do your homework as a good Ned. You know, one of the most important things right from the start is a really good induction program into the business. And it's beholden on the Ned themselves to really make sure they get that, and that they get enough under the skin to really actually understand that business before then stepping back to be able to have that insight and to ask those questions. So yeah, it's not one of those things where you just, parachute in once a month, and give out your largesse and your wisdom. You really do need to know what's going on in the business and know enough to be able to know what those key questions are.
And in terms of the relationships, I mean, I've read that in a way, the Ned will typically work very closely with maybe the chief exec, the senior partner, but possibly have less contact with the other partners. Now, in a PLC where the power vests very strongly in the CEO, that may work fine. But how do you cope when you actually got power very much distributed across the partnership?
Well, you do have to have relationships with everybody. I mean, I always think I find it very amusing when people always give you this sort of rough estimate of how much time they think you're going to spend as a NED on a particular role, and I usually work on the principle of sort of, double it and then add the original number you started with. You spend a lot of time, because you do spend a lot of time talking to people. I said back in my talk about the whole listening piece. You spend a lot of time listening. And you do need to make sure you've got everybody's views. You also it's amazing how much time you spend heading off issues before they become issues. I'm not going to give any specific examples, but I spend a lot of time before board meetings. I will look at the agenda. I will know who the personalities are. I'll know what the issues are, and I will speak to a lot of people about them beforehand to make sure that everybody's views been heard, but also to make sure that there's a proper discussion, and ideally that there's a consensus reached.
Excellent. Let's pick up Shamus now, if I may. And Shamus, do you have a non-exec director on your board? Is really the first question. But the second one was really around, you're obviously working away. I won't say in the background, but clearly very few people have probably heard of Engine B on the call today. Hopefully more now. But how do you see the sector engaging once your magic box becomes more widely available?
Yes. Okay. So firstly, on the non-execs, I have to say everything Nicola said, I completely agree with. We have two non-execs. One is Michael Izzer, who's the CEO of the ICAW, and the ICAW is our largest external shareholder. And we have a lady called Sarah Gentleman, who's got experience in the FT100 as a non-exec. And actually, they have standard non-exec roles. And interesting, Nicola, they also have one of them looks after ethics and one looks after values, because we are a purpose-driven organization. And so they will hold me to account on those two things, but also they are a final point of escalation, if you like. If I'm the problem, they can all staff have access to those two non-execs. And it's been really powerful to make sure that we are, because actually Michael Izzer, the CEO of the ICAW, is there to make sure that whatever we do is for the industry, the broader industry, not just accounting. So it's very, very good to kind of keep us focused. So in terms of how the people getting involved, we are actually doing private previews of certain parts of the assets for the audit industry. So over the next 6 weeks, the tools will be used in a whole series of audits and shadow audits around the world. And then we're starting to work on the legal piece. The legal piece, we've got a team going with Birmingham Law School and Imperial and these 6 law firms. And if people are interested in maybe getting their property section to, for example, to engage, that'd be really helpful actually, because we want to ratify the data models and the knowledge graphs and actually get people to start testing them and saying, actually, this doesn't work for this use case, right? So we're passionate about getting more and more people involved in a very open fashion. So you're on mute, Richard.
Francesca, I don't know if you've come across Engine B at all in your sort of professional side, but it seems to me it is possibly a global topic that needs quite a lot more attention.
Yeah, I thought it's absolutely fascinating. I know I haven't come across it, but I love the concept. And there's something there around how you pull together lots of information in a really thoughtful way. Perhaps it takes us back to something we've talked about many times on these calls, is just what the pandemic has actually driven that's been positive. That different thinking, that different approach. And it's actually, I think, opened things up quite considerably, because we might have thought quite narrow and domestic. And now you can think a little bit more broadly. I think it's actually fascinating.
Iain, you've been, in a way, sort of part of a process of doing things in a different way as a result of the pandemic. It's speeded up the pace of change enormously. I mean, where do you see the event world once online events are being replaced by face-to-face again? Where do you see that trend going?
I think there's been quite a fundamental, almost quantum shift in how people are going to be working after all this passes over, we're going to be. I mean, the first thing is we're going to be living with this. It's not going to go away. So, in the same way we had the flu pandemic of 1914, and we're still losing 5 to 20,000 a year to flu. There's going to be a similar scenario with COVID, and the government have made it very clear that that's their aspiration is to get to that point now. I think there's been a lot of change in people as individuals. So you can look at it from the company perspective in terms of what works in terms of results, but you can also look at it from a private individual's perspective. I can get more done in half the time with half the travel or less. I've lost my fear of missing out. I used to go to 10, 12 conferences a year because I wanted to gauge the pulse of particular industries, or I would feel left out if I wasn't in those conversations. And I've kind of got over that. So I think I'm going to be attending an awful lot less conferences than I did before in person. And I'm going to be able to dip in and out of certain information online. So I think the way my work has changed, but also from talking to a lot of people, there's going to be a blend. A lot of people are talking about the blend, the other side. And how we're talking with clients is or the feedback we're getting from clients is very much along those lines, which is that this has accelerated what's called the digital transformation. Before this, number of us had a few Zoom calls. We maybe didn't like them so much. It wasn't how our preferred way of doing things. Whereas now we've become extraordinarily familiar with them. And in fact, I find it quite alien to be on the phone these days because I can't see the other people and I can't pick up the visual cues of when they're stopping speaking and when I can start speaking and things of that nature. So I think we're going to enter into an era of things are going to be quite radically different. It's going to vary from organisation to organisation. That people are enjoying an element of home working, and there've been a number of studies done that people would actually like to carry on, certainly for more than they used to, in terms of not having to be chained to the office all of the time. And I would imagine in the legal profession, client engagement, as it has in the medical profession, client engagement is kind of evolving to utilise digital technology and communications more as well. So we don't entirely know, but it's going to be a little different, and it's certainly not going to be a herd rush back to the way it was before. It's very much going to be a new normal.
Oh, thanks very much. And really, that unfortunately, talking about timing, the time is up, sadly. So we will be putting this show, as I mentioned, in the management library, which is available. And it only really remains me to say that I hope you found today valuable. Please encourage your peers to book for future shows. And back next Friday with a whole new panel set. And next Friday we've got who have we got? Derek Southall, who's been looking at the whole sort of technology background. Bernard Savage of 10.5 Boots, looking at marketing, and Francesca with Jeremy again. So again, another interesting show. Look forward to catching up then. We'll be doing the monthly tracker. And in the meantime, wish you a wonderful day and thank our wonderful panel. Thank Iain, thank Nicola, thank Francesca. And thank Shamus for their amazing contributions, and look forward to being with you in a week's time. Bye for now.